Great. Good evening, everyone. My name is Katie Hemphill, and I am Associate Director of the McCarthy's Venture Mentoring Network. Our mission is to match experienced entrepreneurs and intrapreneurs with Northeastern affiliated founders to help scale and launch successful businesses. Before we get started, I'd like to note that this session is being recorded tonight. At this time, I ask that everyone except our speakers please mute your microphones and turn off your cameras to minimize distractions during the discussion. If you have questions for our speakers, please feel free to post your questions to everyone in the chat, which is located in the bottom panel of your Zoom screen. The speakers will be monitoring the chat and answering as many questions as they can as the conversation progresses. Thank you so much for joining us as we kick off Global Entrepreneurship Week at Northeastern University with a very important conversation about entrepreneurship and building a more equitable economy. For those of you joining our celebration for the first time, know that Global Entrepreneurship Week is the largest celebration of innovators and entrepreneurs in the world. Annually, over 40,000 events are scheduled in more than 180 countries, all made possible by the Kauffman Foundation. This evening, I have the pleasure of introducing our incredible moderator for our virtual fireside chat, Dunton Family Dean of the Damore McKim School of Business at Northeastern University, Raj Echambadi. With over 200 faculty members serving more than 5,000 undergraduate and graduate students, the Damore McKim School of Business is known for its thought leadership across all business domains, as well as its excellence in teaching. The essence of Northeastern and Damore McKim is experiential learning. Rigorous academic classroom content is blended with meaningful business experience through our signature global cooperative programs. It's a unique model of business education and one that inspires students and molds them into impactful business leaders. Raj's charge is to collaborate with the talented Damore McKim faculty and staff to execute this vision. Raj cares deeply about the Damore McKim community and the community that surrounds Northeastern University. This conversation tonight will explore the future of entrepreneurship and the impact support from institutions like Damore McKim can have on communities of color, and especially business owners. Without further ado, I will hand the virtual stage over to you, Raj.
Thank you, Katie. Much appreciated. Good evening to all of you. Greetings. I want to, at the outset, thank Katie Hemphill, Wendy Eaton, Gwen Corner, Susan Greeley, and the entire entrepreneurship staff members here, the talented staff members, might I add, for making this possible. Also, thanks to Liza Brentley for and the advancement team for making this event possible. I also see Jeff McCarthy on the call. Jeff and Dan McCarthy are two of the philanthropists who made this whole venture mentoring network possible, the McCarthy's venture mentoring network possible. So Jeff, Dan, thank you. Before I introduce the panelists, the keynote speakers for the day, Betty, Francisco, and Segun, Idowu, what I thought I will do is talk a little bit about the vision for Damore McKim, especially as it relates to an inclusive and equitable economy. We all have seen the rightful protests that have happened about 6 months ago, talking about social justice and promoting social equity. And we at Damore McKim, we have actually taken positive steps afterwards in order to move us towards this inclusive economy. We have miles to go. We are still not there. And that is why this conversation today is extraordinarily important, because we have two passionate people, evangelists and advocates for social justice that will actually counsel us and help us as we move along into this promised journey. Very quickly, we want to be an inclusive institution at Northeastern. And as the Dean of the Damore McKim School of Business, this is a very important objective for me. This is a vision, because at the end of the day, higher education is a noble profession. We educate impactful leaders, and it is our job to advocate for social equity and justice so that the students and learners who come out of Damor Mikim, who graduate out of Damor Mikim, can actually be impactful. That is actually our compact with civil society. Very quickly, as far as the vision for Damor Mikim is concerned, especially as it relates to inclusion, we think there are three ways by which Damor Mikim and Northeastern can actually influence this discussion. Number one, provide access to pipelines, talented pipelines of learners and students who otherwise would not have considered higher education, who otherwise would not have considered, business. The second important thing for us is once we have a student and a learner within Damor Mikim, how do we build the right kind of experiences? This is not only for students who belong to minority backgrounds or first generation. It is our job to educate all students on the importance of social equity and social justice so that we minimize the inequality problems that we are seeing around the world. And last but not the least, as an institution of higher ed, we have an important role to play in terms of exemplifying what sort of an organization we need to run. Again, as I started off my remarks, we have taken baby steps. As far as talented pipelines are concerned, we just launched a program in England with ServiceNow, a digital transformation company, where we are going to recruit apprentices for ServiceNow. We are going to educate them over a 3-year period and provide them with ServiceNow certifications. As they come out, they are going to be employable with the $10 billion ServiceNow ecosystem. The important part about this is that we are taking disadvantaged and vulnerable youth and feeding them into the ServiceNow employment ecosystem. We are planning to export that or import that rather into the United States. And same thing with the Rue Institute. We announced a major campus in Portland, Maine, based out of funding from David Rue and Silver Lake Partners. And the goal is fundamentally to provide access to women and veterans and people who belong to ethnic and racial minorities, etc. As far as building experiences within Damor Mikim is concerned, we have done some important things, including creating a new program called Building Belonging, which is fundamentally targeted towards first generation students so that it is not just the, we can always take care of academic training through mentorship, etc. But fundamentally, the social mentorship and bringing people into the fabric of Damor Mikim, that is what this program does. We have, over the last 6 months or so, we have done a program called Amplifying Black Voices, bringing in students, listening to the students so that we can build an experience for them and for other people, one that they can be extremely proud of. Again, the list goes on and on. We have a new diversity council, which advises us on the future of Damor Mikim and how we need to accommodate diverse audiences and so on. And then when it comes to entrepreneurship, even the Venture Mentoring Network has a committee called BIPOC, which is kind of looking at mentorship in proximate communities and so on. And last but not the least, we have a student organization called NU Impact, which is fundamentally looking to invest in our local communities in Boston and so on. Again, as I started off by saying, we have miles to go. And that is why people like Betty and Segun are extraordinarily important by not only collaborating with us, but also more importantly, holding us accountable. So without further ado, I have great pleasure in introducing the two panelists for the day. Betty Francisco. Betty is an alum of Northeastern, MBA 97 and JD 98. And we thank Betty for being such a wonderful evangelist for Northeastern. She just told us that she has a a co-op student that started today with her. So thank you. Betty is general counsel at Campus Working Capital. And she's also co-founder of Amplify Latinx, and she's going to talk about how they advance economic and political power for Latinos. She is also a co-founder of Investors of Color Network, which is actually building an ecosystem of Black and Latinx accredited investors to close the racial funding gap in startup capital. She's also an angel investor. The Boston Business Journal named Betty as one of 2020's Power 50 Extraordinary Year, Extraordinary People edition. And in 2018, Boston Magazine named her as one of the 100 most influential people in Boston. So thank you, Betty. Segun Idowu is actually the executive director of the Black Economic Council of Massachusetts, where he advocates policies, practices, and contracts that positively impact its member businesses. Recently, they held the successful Massachusetts Black Expo, which featured 60 plus Black-owned businesses and organizations and connected 1,000 people, close to 1,000 people, to about 25 plus business development workshops. In April 2020, Boston Magazine recognized Segun as one of the 100 most influential people in the city of Boston. And in July 2020, the Boston Globe recognized him on the front page of its Sunday edition as a man of the moment for his work in ramping up the Black Economic Council of Massachusetts efforts to advocate for and direct resources to Black businesses impacted by the COVID pandemic. Again, I'm extraordinarily delighted and honored to have Betty and Segun today as our keynote speakers. So Betty, first, I'm going to hand over the virtual mic to you and request you to talk about your work with Amplify Latinx and Investors of Color Network. Please go ahead.
Sure. Well, thank you, Raj, for that wonderful welcome. And it's exciting to be here as part of the kickoff of Global Entrepreneurship Week. Thanks to the whole Northeastern team for bringing this amazing event together. So a little bit about Amplify Latinx. I'm the co-founder of this nascent nonprofit. We originally started as a network for women, for Latinas, and it was about building Latinas across sectors into positions of power and influence. And 3 years ago, we launched Amplify Latinx, which is inclusive of both men and women. And the focus is to build economic and political power for Latinos in Massachusetts. And we do that by focusing on developing civically engaged leaders across sectors who are Latinx and who will advocate for positive social change. We know that in Massachusetts and across the country, Latinos and African Americans are underrepresented in positions of power, both in our legislatures, on our boards, our commissions, and in our executive suites. And in order to affect positive change, right, in order to build what we're calling these inclusive ecosystems and economies, we need to actually have a seat at the table. And so part of our work is ensuring that individuals that represent our communities are reflective, right, in areas where there are decision-making roles. So that's a bit about Amplify Latinx. One of our programs we call Power Up. It's our business initiative. It's focused on connecting Latino businesses with each other, with also resources that support small businesses. What we find is that many of our Latino businesses, either for lack of social networks or challenges with language access, may not have deep social networks that you need to be successful when you're running a business. And so part of the goal is to better connect our ecosystem of resources to these entrepreneurs. And during, what we saw during COVID was this deep need to foster those connections and better communicate the plethora of resources, right, that exist to support them. It's just they're not connecting to them. And then the other piece that Amplify is doing is also advocating for policy change, right? So holding leaders accountable. And Segun is going to talk about this because he's actually done a lot of work in the policy area. It's both advocating for increased funding that's race conscious, that's focused on Black and Latino entrepreneurs. It's also holding our leaders accountable, right, for creating more access to contracting opportunities in government and in our corporations. And it's also ensuring that there is this representation right across the board. So that's a bit about Amplify. In terms of the Investors of Color Network, again, we find that there's a lot of focus today on supporting entrepreneurs of color, creating more capital access for them. But we also need to focus on the investor side, right? How do we really build wealth in our communities of color? If not, but for giving more opportunities for people of color to create wealth through investments. And you can invest in multiple ways, right? Both through home ownership, building equity in real estate, but it's also through investments and through investing in small businesses. So we're trying to foster an ecosystem where from the start early on, we're saying to people of color, you can begin investing now. You can actually invest in a small business through a crowdsourcing campaign, for example. You don't always need to be an accredited investor to support local business. You could buy local, right? You can seed an early stage venture with just buying their product. So there's multiple ways to begin creating this culture of investing, but also building wealth in our communities by seeding more entrepreneurs of color.
Thank you, Betty. Actually, one of the things that I wanted to say when you talk about investors of color is we have a couple of researchers within the Mormicum. Venkat Kupaswamy is one of them, who basically examines the whole issue of race and performance as it relates to crowdfunding performance. So at some point in time, we'll connect you to him because his work has very interesting policy implications, and especially as it relates to the impact of race and performance. Segun, handing over the floor to you to talk about your initiatives.
Well, thank you very much, Raj, for hosting this conversation. Thank you to Katie and Liza and Wendy and the rest of the team for helping to organize this and keep us on track. And especially thank you to Betty for the invitation to be here. If it weren't for her recommendation, I wouldn't be here. So I'm happy to participate in this and to listen to not only what she has to share, but what the rest of the group here, what they have to offer. So there's something my grandfather told me 8 years ago. And it was, I don't remember, we were watching something on TV. I don't remember what it was, but I remember what he shared with me was that we shouldn't confuse motion with progress, because if I had pushed his rocking chair, it would have moved and made no progress. And Black Bostonians in particular, but all minority communities in Boston found out 5 years ago that the racial wealth gap in the greater Boston area was ever widening. And we all know the famous statistic now out of the Fed Reserve's report on that racial wealth gap, the Color of Wealth report that they published, where we get the $8 in net worth for Black families and $247,500 for white families. And of course, this statistic made everyone upset, but it was a clear indication that we had been putting all of our efforts in motion that was not producing any progress. And so one of the things that came out of all of the community meetings that happened in response to the statistic, the biggest one being in Dorchester, in the Grove Hall area of Dorchester, where about 700, particularly African Americans, turned out to discuss how to address this, was BECMA. The founders of the organization, other community leaders met on that night in November, actually, and in subsequent meetings, and determined that we needed an organization that was going to advocate and push for and bring about economic equity and justice for our communities for the betterment of the entire Commonwealth. And so BECMA was founded essentially to serve as a chamber of commerce for Black businesses across the state of Massachusetts. In that time, everything we do falls into three different buckets where we support our 300 members now across the state. The first is advocacy, as Betty lifted up. We push for policies on the local, state, and now the federal level that are going to impact our businesses, help to remove barriers to whether it be capital or contracts, et cetera, to ensure they have access to opportunities. We convene solutions-oriented conversations, so much like this particular conversation that's focused on the solution and not just talking about the problems that exist, because particularly for Black and Latinx communities, we know the problem, it's our experience. So we talk only about solutions and highlight people and organizations that are committing to the solutions, because so often, there's so much bad news that comes our way that it's difficult to pick up the little bursts of sunshine. And then finally, the connections that we make for our members. So, whether it be through networking events where we connect our businesses to one another, because we want to foster this ecosystem of Black businesses using Black goods and services, but also connecting our members to opportunities in the procurement space, to investment opportunities. Raj, you mentioned in your introduction the event that we just did this past weekend, the Mass Black Expo, which we did virtually, where we connect. So we have our exhibit hall connecting folks to procurement officers and CEOs to develop relationships where they can get potentially contracts, but also connecting just our entire community to one another, whether you be a resident, whether you be an entrepreneur, an investor, an elected official, but making sure that we're fostering these relationships where, we may not be able to measure it, on a piece of paper that, this led to X amount of business for somebody. But at the end of the day, we know that all of these opportunities are created through relationships. And so what we do is to create that atmosphere to build those relationships. So that's essentially what BECMA does. And we have a great plan for what we'll be doing starting in 2021 to ensure we're reaching more people. But everything we do at the end of the day is to grow Black businesses, because we know that the development of some communities cannot coexist with the underdevelopment of others. So everything we do is to ensure that even though we're focused on Black businesses, at the end of the day, we know that if we're strengthening Black businesses, we're really strengthening the entire economy.
Thank you, Segun. So I want to, you talked about the power of connections, and Betty in her opening remarks talked about the power of capital. And together it is fundamentally about enhancement of capital and connection. So I want to open it up with a broad question. Given that entrepreneurship is a significant engine for an economy, etc., what are the obstacles people of color face, especially in the entrepreneurship space, and how can we as a society, and then perhaps as an institution of higher ed, actually leverage or change some things so that we can bring more people of color into the entrepreneurship space, thereby leading to an equitable economy? Segun, I'm going to start out with you and then hand over to Betty. Go ahead. So
traditionally, the response to this question is a lack of access to whether it be capital or to these networks. I will rephrase that by saying it's the exclusion of Black and Latinx people from these circles. So the barrier has, at the end of the day, what we're talking about right now, particularly after the lynching of George Floyd, is systemic racism and what that means for the future of the nation. And so now everybody's paying attention to this, though we have all been struggling to, defeat or take down these systems of racism. So part of it is that the exclusion of these communities. But at the end of the day, I think the way we remove those barriers is kind of what you just talked about, not just now, but in your opening, on how Demore McKim is seeking to bring in more people to those circles that at one point were excluded. And it could have been, whether it be intentional or just by nature of, we invite people that we know. And so if these people aren't already in our circles, then it just fosters this cycle of exclusion. So, at the end of the day, that's what keeps us out, because there is no lack of entrepreneurship spirit in our community. That's how we've kept things going. So it really is that exclusion that I'm happy you all are taking some steps to push back on that.
Sure. Betty?
And just to build on Segun's point, so it's exclusion, but they're also, speaking to policies, right? There's still systemic barriers, like there's practices, right, that our historical institutions that create capital continue to play a role in, right? So whether it's banks or other institutions that provide capital or create access to capital, we keep perpetuating the same thing, right? Not because we're terrible people, but because there's embedded practices that we continue to follow, and so it takes intentional thought, right? To say, how do we break down those barriers and actually start from a standpoint of what do our entrepreneurs need, right? So what's different about entrepreneurs of color from white entrepreneurs? There's not a whole lot other than it's what's the access point, and then how do you start to break that down so you create level playing fields? So I think some of what Demore McKim is doing, around for your venture fund, for example, right? Creating a different pool of capital that's going to look at entrepreneurs that may be what we call historically underestimated, right? They're not the pool that our VCs are looking at, but they will look at them. And I think it's moving the needle around, why would we look at Black and Latinx entrepreneurs differently, right? We should be looking at their ventures in the same way, right? Are they creating new access to markets? Is their solution innovative, right? But we have a narrative issue with our businesses in that we undervalue them often because, right, there's systemic racism, or we have these underlying biases. So there's a lot of intentionality that needs to go into just how we even assess ventures, right? Because the questions that we ask our entrepreneurs of color are actually different from our white entrepreneurs. So holding ourselves accountable for how we assess, right? How we evaluate, how we open up and create more access. And I think some of the work that's already being done is excellent, right? It just has to be scaled, right? So when we talk about even connections, our entrepreneurs of color, again, may not have the same social networks. And when we say social networks, is access to powerful people that can get shit done, right? Get shit done for them. And so how do we foster that? This is where the Northeastern network is amazing, right? Can open up doors exponentially for people. It could be champions for entrepreneurs, but they have to be willing to do that, right? So it's how do you foster these relationships of trust in the beginning? And BECMA and Amplify are just some of the few organizations. You already have connections to community groups that work with entrepreneurs of color, and it's continuing to build those relationships through the co-op program, through the faculty networks. You have amazing mentors, right? How do we create more access? I have entrepreneurs telling me, I wish I just had a mentor, right? Someone that could guide me. Let's foster that, right, in a deeper way, because it really is, in the end, it's who you have around you, right, as advisors and supporters that can make or break a venture. It's not always about the money.
Very interesting. And I'm going to request the audience to please send in your questions to our panelists. And I wanted to talk to you both, Betty and Segun. You have worked together on a number of initiatives. Even in our call last week, you talked about the power of coalitions that you have built, etc. Could you provide us some sort of an example of the power of coalitions, especially as it relates to building an inclusive community and an economy? So I'll go to Betty first and then Segun.
Sure. So one example that I think we're all really proud of is it stemmed from this work around the Paycheck Protection Program. So as many of you know, right, when round 2 of the PPP loans came out, there was concern around whether our smaller businesses, entrepreneurs of color in particular, could get access to the second round. We know that in the first round, it was the larger companies with access to banking relationships and good advisors, right, that had sort of first dibs to the PPP loans. So a coalition came about led by the Foundation for Business Equity, LISC, Mass Growth Capital, and a set of 5 local banks that decided that it was important to create specific access for those businesses that had been left out the first round. So Black, Latino, Asian, women-owned businesses, right? Immigrant-owned businesses. And so these 5 banks said, we will provide the loans regardless of whether they're banking relationships or not, and we will process them as quickly as we can. And so a coalition of 40 or so community-based and business organizations came together, where we literally, I've never seen anything like it, where TA, technical assistance, was provided to over 660 businesses. $4.2 million in PPP loans were made accessible, right, because of the technical assistance that was provided. But more importantly, the time that we spent together as coalition partners built these relationships, right? Because we spent day and night together. Basically, in the morning, we had a technical assistance call, and then in the evening, we had a coalition call. And it was about how do we continue to identify the businesses that need the most help? How do we get them the support in language accessible format, right? So we knew another issue was how to help support businesses with different language in different languages. And so that brought us together so closely that we then started to do other things together. For example, we did a statewide survey of small businesses, and we over-surveyed Black and Latino and Asian businesses to see how they were doing in this COVID era, especially as we reopened, right? So we did this survey with Massey Polling Group and had over 1,800 responses. Another is that this coalition has now evolved into something called the Coalition for an Equitable Economy. And we're working now on building an inclusive ecosystem, starting with assessing what are the capital providers, who are the TA providers, and others that are focused on supporting Black, Brown, immigrant-owned businesses. So it's still a lot of work, right? It's at its stages. But what COVID has done is that it has brought together organizations that traditionally hadn't worked together before, that were siloed, I would say, and now made them work together around a common goal, right? And so we're seeing this opportunity to continue building on that relationships of trust, and doing more, right, across what the ecosystem needs. And Segun, I hope, talks about the policy work, the area where we've collaborated.
Segun, that's a perfect segue into your response. Please go ahead.
Right, and I smiled when you asked the question because I'm extremely proud of the work, or really the success, as Betty mentioned, that we've had as a coalition. I mean, like I think I mentioned earlier, I grew up in Boston and have not ever seen nonprofits, particularly in my community, working together. And as Betty mentioned, COVID has forced really for some folks, these groups to work together. And we have only reaped the benefits of that. And so with BECMA and Amplify in particular working together on the advocacy side, so like right at the beginning, so Betty mentioned the second round of PPP, but in the first round of PPP, we automatically understood what the issues were and why a national group could report that 95% of Black businesses didn't get any PPP money, that 91% of Latinx businesses didn't get any money in the first round. And so, we had our Globe op-ed, and then we also worked with Congresswoman Presley. And the result of that was the Saving Our Streets Act, or SOS Act, that Congresswoman Presley introduced and authored with now Vice President-elect Harris and Senator Harris. And so that bill, if passed, would have diverted $125 billion to small businesses, 75% of it being set aside for minority businesses and women-owned businesses. And as Congresswoman Presley says everywhere she goes, that bill was in direct response to the advocacy work of groups like BECMA and Amplify, who had brought to her office, none of us are getting this money and here is why. And so that was a way to reshape PPP. So that was one way. Another way, just recently on the policy side, so back in January, these two intrepid reporters at WGBH began writing an investigative series on how the state was doing business or not doing business with Black and Latinx companies. And what we saw back in January was the state actually over the last 20 years, the value of contracts has gone down by $100 million with our businesses, and we're just not getting our fair shake. And so back in January, we sent a number of, I'll call them targets, others might call them demands, to the governor's office and said, here's what needs to happen in order to address this issue. And we heard crickets, there was nothing. But that's because BECMA sent it by itself. As an organization, we sent a letter on our letterhead that said, Governor Baker, here's what needs to happen, and we got nothing. Then in September, another series of articles came out in WGBH, this time showing that essentially, this is the claim they made, so I'm not saying this, so no one from the state can attack me for this, but essentially saying that the Baker administration was falsifying essentially the numbers they were putting out. They were combining not only what the state spent, but what others spent and taking credit for that. And so we immediately reached out to the governor's office, this time with Amplify, Mass Association of CDCs, Foundation for Business Equity, Commonwealth Kitchen, and all these other groups, because of these relationships we had established as a result of COVID, and said, all of us want to meet with the governor and talk about these same demands. And so as a result of that meeting, just last, or 2 weeks ago now, the day before the election, Governor Baker said, okay, we're going to do everything that you called for, which was making the Supplier Diversity Office an independent entity under the Secretariat of Admin and Finance, of ensuring we're creating a pipeline to contracts at the state level, ensuring that there are no barriers to language access, for whether it be on the website or any applications, things like that. And also this $51 million grant program that the governor announced, again, came from the result of our advocacy work in coalition, saying that Governor Baker, none of us got PPP. And if you don't live in Boston or Salem or Worcester, you had no relief. And so that $51 million now for small business grants being available to us is important, with the caveat that minority businesses get priority, and there is no first come, first served mentality, which was the issue with PPP. So all of these things, and I could go on and on, believe me, and I'm happy to, because it shows what the power of working together toward the same goals can do and can get you.
No, fantastic. So as Miel Markey wrote in her chat, she speaks for all of us. You're both doing so much to change the status quo. Proud of you, proud of all of your hard work. So thank you, Betty, Segun. And I think Katie is ready with some audience questions. Katie, please go ahead.
I am. Thank you so much, Raj. Following up on kind of this conversation about support, Betty and Segun, we have a question from Raphael. Are there specific industries that face the highest challenges that you've seen? I'm going to let you two take it from there.
Betty,
No.
So yes, there are, and I'm going to start with and we know this via the massing poll that Betty mentioned earlier, that I will say Amplify spearheaded, but I'm going to start with another report. So the Brookings Institution released a report back in April, and on the last economic recovery back in the early 2000s, and one of the statistics from that report said that between 2008 and 2012, white-owned businesses, male and female-owned, lost a total of 1.6 million jobs in that time, and that minority-owned businesses and women-owned businesses helped to add 1.8 million jobs to the national economy. One of the reasons that we were able to do that, particularly for the minority community, was that we were in the areas of restaurants, hair care, personal care, et cetera. All the things that all the businesses we are in now, but because of, we were just able to stimulate the economy and hire people and things like that. Those are the exact industries that are being threatened by COVID-19. So that's why this should concern us right now, that these are the industries that are not only being impacted for decades because they require in-person human contact, but also traditionally and historically, these are the only industries that we could explode in and start so many. I mean, you drive down Washington Street in Dorchester, and near the Codman Square area, you'll see a whole slew of Jamaican restaurants and barbershops and hair salons, and it's because traditionally that's all we could do, because we're in our neighborhoods, and a white-owned business doing your hair is not going to open up in Dorchester, and so that's what we had to do. But they're also being threatened, and so again, I'll stop talking. But the way we support these businesses is through these grant programs, but also helping people pivot to the more technological age, which a lot of people don't have the capital right now to do. Anyway, long answer, but that's what's suffering right now.
No, and that's right. And you know, there are conversations happening right now, even within our coalition, around what kinds of industries, right, should we perhaps be encouraging our Black and Latino businesses to look into, because the traditional ones that we're in, right, there are many being threatened, you know, both from hospitality, retail, food, and childcare. There's new industries surfacing, right, where we could actually be encouraging more innovation in, and where we need, frankly, the diversity of thought. So, you know, part of the work going forward too is not only encouraging the pivots, right? So helping our smaller businesses do this digital transformation work, but perhaps also seeding entrepreneurs and employees into these new industries. And frankly, this is where Northeastern could play a really important role, a key role, right, in terms of training programs, certification programs. I mean, this sounds very, very funny, but you know, cannabis, right, has become a new industry. Are we encouraging more individuals to go into it? How do we break down the barriers that exist in that, again, budding industry, right? Because there's many, but part of it is it's highly regulated. So how do we create more access? You know, green energy, for example, another one. Like, there's many new industries that are, in fact, you know, thriving, right, for other entrepreneurs, but not for ours. And so, how do we encourage more of them to go into those new sectors?
And when Betty said budding, it was no pun intended.
No.
That's amazing.
Words carefully.
Yes. Thank you. So the next question I have here that came in a little more recently, but is related to all of the research you've done, right? And how well you know your businesses, specifically in the Boston area. How does the Boston context for minorities reflect the rest of the nation? Do you have feedback on that? Betty, I know that you're unmuted, so I might let you take this first.
How does the Boston context
as it relates to the startup community and lack of access to resources, right? Lack of access to connections and capital. How does that reflect kind of to the rest of the nation?
So there's actually a statistics, I forget if it's Credit Biz or something like that, that does, you know, a survey of where the best places to start a business or to be an entrepreneur of color. And I think Massachusetts or Boston, right, which is the biggest city, falls somewhere in the lower middle. So it's not that we don't have, Boston actually is very rich in capital and resources. It's whether they are accessible to the demographic that we're talking about, right? So I would tell you anecdotally, a lot of the Black and Latinx businesses that tried to do business here, particularly raise capital. So if you're talking about, you know, raising capital, whether it's angel or VC capital, it's harder here. And many tend to go somewhere else, right? They feel like they have to raise money in Silicon Valley or in New York or, you know, or Miami, because they're just not getting it here. And again, I think it's partly the relationships, right? Either not having them or there being challenges with discrimination, right? Or just straight up racism. But that is a sort of a stigma that Boston has, right? That it's more difficult to raise money here as a woman or as an entrepreneur of color. And again, so how do we shift that, right? So it's creating more, this is where my investors of color hat comes in, right? So if you have individuals here that you know are friendly, right, that you can access and who will open doors for you, we can start to create a space where Boston is looked at as a place where you're going to get, right, more access as opposed to less. And so it does require concerted effort amongst not just existing capital providers, right? Because I'll be honest, I don't have a lot of hope that many are going to change, but rather how do we create new capital providers, right? New types of seed, early stage funds or investors that are going to be intentional about supporting Black and brown businesses.
I wish I could add to that, but you know, this goes back to another conversation. Betty and I are touring. It's, you know, we're on similar panels everywhere. But every time Betty talks before me, I'm just like, yeah, what she said. That's
Yeah,
exactly
what
what
you
it
said. Yeah, we're like we're brother and sister now.
is. Exactly.
But we have a lot of mutual admiration because, you know, this work actually it requires, I would say, a lot of courage, right? Because what I would tell you a couple years ago, I would not be speaking the way I am because I would be afraid, right, that I'm going to get backlash, that someone's going to think negatively of me. At this point, you know, I think the George Floyd era, what he has brought, the good thing he's brought to us is this ability to talk openly about race and our barriers and how we can change. So I feel like a lot of courageous conversations have been sprung because of our climate.
I really appreciate that insight, you know, and it's great insight to have for everybody here on the call today. Speaking of, you know, kind of interfacing with Black and Latinx business founders, we have a question from a mentor in the audience. He says, his name is Martin, and he says, as a white man from a Midwest suburb, how can I be authentic when I come across Black or Latinx startups in the beginning? I have already struggled enough to genuinely mentor female CEOs. How do I do this with Black and Latinx businesses?
That's a great question. And I think we're all figuring that part out because, you know, there was an effort undertaken earlier this summer where well-intentioned white CEOs wanted to direct support toward Black and Latinx businesses. But part of the problem was that a lot of the people providing the support were white. And so our community, you know, there's a lot of cultural stuff that essentially it winds up looking like an army of charity workers or mission workers providing charity. And so our community usually rebuffs and you know, repels against that. But in terms of being authentic, I think treating people like people as opposed to, I want to help this person because they're Black or Latinx, that will dictate the type of relationship you have. You know, so, you know, as you would be supporting your son or daughter to help their business should be the same way you approach the relationship, that this is a person with a great idea and they're just missing a few links in the chain to get them up and running, and you have those resources to provide that support. I think that's the best way to go into building these relationships, as opposed to on your end believing that this is what's going to get you into heaven, essentially, that let me help this person because they are a minority and oppressed and all that, but rather supporting them because they're just a great entrepreneur that just needs a little boost to become successful. So I think, you know, the authenticity comes from you and in the reason that you were helping the person. I think that's where it comes from.
Betty, do you want to add anything there?
No, I think Segun said it all.
This is a great dynamic you two have going on. Really fabulous. Love it. So what I'd like to do is ask you a couple of more questions and then invite Raj back for a couple of remarks before we close out the program here. So first and foremost, I want to change the topic of the conversation a bit here and talk about supporting established companies, right, whose ripple effects are greater than startups sometimes. What are your thoughts on how can we impact the survival rate, right, of established companies in your communities, right, to ensure that their ripple effect positively impacts the greater good of the entrepreneurial ecosystem and the overall ecosystem and economy?
Yeah, so a couple of thoughts. So in the survey that we mentioned, the small business survey, we asked a question of what do you need now, right? And that survey varied in terms of the size of business, but virtually for Black and Latinx response rates, what they said is we need more access to funding in the form of grants, not loans. We need new customers and markets. And the second was around, the third, sorry, was around digital transformation. So what I would say with the larger ones, it really is, you know, barring the capital, which we know, like we need a, you know, comprehensive stimulus package from our federal government, but let's say that comes, the other side of the equation, where again, I think Northeastern can play a really valuable role, is around that creation of and build up of new customers, new markets. So that what does that mean, right? It means how can our Northeastern ecosystem really serve as the anchor institution, right? So Northeastern purchases, Northeastern builds, Northeastern invests. And so across those three areas, what are we doing, right, to contract with and support our local businesses? So are we buying from them, right? Are we providing when we build new buildings, right? Who are our architects? Who are our trades? Who are the subs, right? So it's creating opportunities to contract with our local community of businesses. And then on the investment side, have we looked at our endowment? I mean, across the board now, I think higher ed is looking at endowments and saying, who are we using as managers, right? Who are we investing our money with? And looking at diverting or changing some investments so that we're investing with emerging managers, right? So funds that are led by people of color. And there is data, right, showing that funds led by emerging managers or diverse managers actually outperform those that are not, like they do better. And so we're almost leaving money on the table, right, by not looking at how our endowments are invested. So I would say those three ways are a starting point, right, for how Northeastern can continue to foster support for larger and small businesses.
That's great. Thank you. Segun, do you want to add anything to Betty's comment? Great. Okay. So Raj, I want to invite you back into the conversation here to provide a couple of conclusion remarks before I provide some closing remarks.
Yeah. So I actually, I'm going to go back to Segun and Betty actually very quickly. But, one of the, this conversation can go on for another couple of hours. Actually, we have just scratched the surface. Segun, I wanted to ask you about how to connect the blueprint for the new world to Damar McKim and Northeastern. Maybe we should have that separate conversation. But I want to connect two thoughts. One, Damar McKim, actually the future we think is about developing impactful leaders that are ready to navigate this world of digital transformation. That's our focus, that's our vision. So when you talk about how COVID-19 has had a disproportionately negative impact on communities of color and thereby affecting entrepreneurship, affecting the economic prospects, etc., the fear is this economic inequality will only be exacerbated because of the types of businesses that communities of color are engaged in. So we are ready to stand with you because we are moving towards digital transformation, which is what I told you about in ServiceNow, etc. Happy to partner with you, which is what my question is going to be. You both are major believers in the power of coalitions. And because coalitions obviously lead to collaborations, to empowerment, and empowerment actually has accountability as an important component. So how can we, your two organizations and Northeastern and specifically Damar McKim, collaborate, connect, if you will, in order to help communities of color in terms of entrepreneurship and other economic opportunities and thereby build an equitable economy? So I'm going to, ask each of you to answer that briefly. Segun, can I request you?
But you added that briefly, so I'll do my best. Well, just for the folks that are joining, as a very quick, just to talk about what it is. So after the lynching of George Floyd, BACMA convened about a dozen or so Black and Indigenous leaders from across the state to put on paper what exactly Black and Indigenous communities have been pushing for. We were getting that question a lot when the uprisings occurred. What do Black people want? So we identified 5 sectors: private sector, foundations, nonprofit, state and local government, and identified 5 different things that each of those categories could do to address systemic racism. So that's the blueprint, and happy to share information on that. In terms of what Damore McKim could do, you know, a lot of the conversation is focused on the school itself, but what I would love to see happen is a convening of all of the business schools in the area. You know, so this is where Damore McKim could be the leader in convening all business schools to talk about, you know, how we move forward on any and everything that groups like Beckma and Amplify and others in this space recommend. Because, you know, there's an Ethiopian quote that says, when spiders unite, they can tie down any lion. And the lion here is an inequitable economy and really the collapse of the Black and Latinx economy, which would be disastrous for not just the Commonwealth, but the nation, because we provide so much. I saw one of the questions was, you know, what is the impact of our businesses? And I know for Black businesses, the last census says there are 2,000 businesses that employ 2,000 firms that employ 14,000 people and contribute several billion dollars to the state. And for a state that's losing money and has little in the coffers, we need that. So we can't afford to let our businesses fail. So I would love to see the convening of these schools to talk about how we move forward on these recommendations, because Damore McKim can't do it all by itself. As many resources as you all have, it shouldn't be just on you, because at the end of the day, the whole institution contributes to systemic racism. So all of you should be working together to tear down that system. So
No, that's fantastic. Fantastic. Betty?
Yeah, actually, I love that idea of bringing other schools, you know, together. I mean, we saw this in the healthcare sector during COVID, right? Hospitals that never, fierce competitors, never talked to each other, had to collaborate, right, to address this larger COVID issue. So I think that makes a ton of sense. You know, the other thing is I would love to see us convene other community groups like Amplify and Beckma, right? Because it's not just us. There's other groups,
Yes.
you know, like Ujima and Commonwealth Kitchen, and then there's others up in, you know, further out across Massachusetts. But to hear what our small businesses want, right? I think we often try to develop solutions without really understanding what are their needs. And again, we saw this with the PPP loans, right? The program was not designed really for our micro businesses, right? Which was intended to serve small businesses, but it wasn't designed in a way that could truly support them in the way that they need. And so I think one way would be, right, to let's have some kind of, you know, I wrote this down, like a community advisory board comprised of small business owners, where you could hear what do they need in the moment, right? Because right now, like I said, we've said this, it's, you know, a lot of digital transformation, that's one, a lot of advisory services, right? So just, you know, how do you even keep your business afloat, right? For the next 3-4 months, where we know we're going to have, again, a retraction, we're going to have closures, right? There's just not enough money to go around right now. So how do we, as a larger ecosystem, help keep these businesses afloat for a little bit longer? So we need all collective minds, right, on board to do that. So that's one. I think another is that Northeastern has this tremendous pool of talent, right? So you're producing talent. You also have faculty that's talent. You know, I know you do this already, but supporting businesses from a consulting standpoint,
Sure.
the co-op program, doubling down on all of that and providing that, you know, I would say labor, right, capacity to keep these businesses afloat in a way that's not cost constraining would be another way to think creatively about that. But you know, right, we haven't talked much about this, but we're, you know, we have a really dire situation coming in the winter. And it's already predicted, right, that probably a third or a half of our Latinx and Black businesses will close. But we can come out on the other side, right, if we start to put in place some of the right seeding tools. Correct. Because new ones will form, and that's what we want. We want, you know, that's fine if this one shuts down, but let's put these entrepreneurs in a position that they're not personally affected, right, so significantly, and that they can actually see new businesses.
No, thank you, Betty. Thank you, Segun. The whole notion of convening not only of higher ed institutions, but also of similarly community-minded organizations is phenomenal. We will work on it and we will be in touch. We'll stay connected because, as I said before, to me, this is not just a theoretical exercise. It has got to have some sort of an action orientation. And so you both have given us a lot of ideas, and we'll be in touch. And so thank you so much for this engrossing conversation. So I'm going to hand over the floor to Katie for her closing remarks. Katie, floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Raj, and a huge thanks to you, Betty and Segun, for your insights and tangible takeaways that you shared with the audience tonight. I know that we're a few minutes over, and I thank everybody for bearing with us. This conversation is so important, and as Raj said, we could have been here for another couple of hours. So there is a lot of work to do, and it will take a commitment from a variety of communities, such as ours at Northeastern, to help make change. So thanks again, for discussing it with our community tonight. At this time, I'd also like to thank Jeff and Dan McCarthy again for helping us host important events like tonight's through the McCarthy's Venture Mentoring Network. I'd also like to thank my incredible colleagues who helped make tonight's virtual event happen. First, I'd like to thank Wendy Eaton, the Venture Mentoring Network's program analyst and virtual community manager. She's amazing and made sure that we had a seamless experience in tonight's virtual venue. Second, I'd like to thank my partners in advancement and DeMoore McKim Communication. I extend a huge thanks to Miel Marquis, who helped connect us to Betty and Segun, and to Liza Brantley, Ann Nielsen, and Heather Hill, who helped curate the conversation topics tonight and invite all of you to join us at this event. As a reminder, Northeastern has a full week of impactful, engaging events planned. Right after this tonight, our student-led partner NU Impact is kicking off a 2-day seminar called Rebuilding an Economy That Works for All, very much on the same topic here. In the chat, you will find a link to our full list of event offerings. Thanks, Wendy. And you'll see there that we are hosting another important conversation about intercultural competence as a useful tool in the startup workplace on Friday, November 20th at noon. I hope to see many of you at some of our other virtual events this week. Have a wonderful evening, and virtual applause for all who participated and attended tonight. Thank you so much.